Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 253 part 2. This is obviously delayed by 1 week because while all these questions were being asked I was in Australia, so obviously not able to answer them immediately upon my return, but there you go, that's just life. Nonetheless, let's get on with the questions. Kra F1 asks, what types of naval ships typically had a complement of divers aboard, and what were their typical duties? This is another one of those questions where the sort of top answer is it depends greatly on the Navy and it depends greatly on the time period, because diving as a formal qualification, as opposed to just something a sailor might be able to do, evolves during the time period the Channel covers, pretty much over the latter part of the 19th and then the early 20th centuries. And it evolves kind of concurrent with the development of useful diving suits. Now, obviously, there were some very early diving suits that go quite a way back. There were even forms of diving suits before the 19th century. But in terms of all the equipment that you would need, and that's not just the diving suit, we're also talking about pumps for the air and so on and so forth. The expense, rarity, and difficulty of use for those relative to their need was, that's a very difficult equation to balance in the early to mid part of the 19th century, and so you're not really going to see them aboard ships. As, however, diving technology becomes a little bit more useful, and bear in mind that even in the early 20th century, the classic thought of, the big bronze or brass, almost spherical helmet with portholes is still pretty much the top-end naval diving equipment. The stuff that you see here with, what we might consider to be nowadays scuba masks, wetsuits, etc., that's kind of a development of the interwar period and going into World War II. And there are actually limitations on what the independent of surface airline units like this can do compared to the full suits. And you see the Pearl Harbor salvage videos for the use of both types of diving suits. But as a result, the divers, as in qualified divers specifically assigned to ships, they start to come in during what effectively is the last period the Channel covers, i.e. World War I, World War II, the interwar period. And their duties also evolve, because initially their duties might be things like, making sure that the screws are kept clear of obstructions. If a fishing net or a chain or a wire or something gets looped around the screws, the diver will have to go down, or divers, to try and untangle that all. Then as torpedoes start to become a threat, sailors with diving qualifications were preferred in some aspects of deploying and maintaining the torpedo nets for hopefully fairly obvious reasons. And then once you get into mines becoming a danger, not just out in the open sea, but the potential for people to lay mines within harbours, then divers are now called upon to inspect anchorages, and so forth, in order to verify that there isn't a mine that's been dropped there while the ship was away, especially once aerial dropped mines become a thing, particularly in the Second World War. And then, of course, during the Second World War as well, you see the use of limpet mines by diving equipped sailors that are on sabotage missions. You see that on both sides, and of course, once somebody invents a capability, then you have to invent a capability to counter that. And diving inspections of a hull to ensure that someone hadn't stuck limpet mines on you are beginning to become a thing as the time period that the Channel covers begins to come to an end. But with the expense out of the diving equipment and, of course, the relative value of the ship and the number of people aboard a ship, you will start to see divers or sailors that are qualified as divers, which can be slightly different things. They might start coming in aboard the bigger ships, battleships, battle cruisers, later on carriers, maybe cruisers, and that will gradually percolate down through the fleet as time goes on in the early part of the 20th century. And the reason I made that distinction just now between divers and sailors who are qualified as divers is that a sailor who is qualified as a diver might receive an additional stipend within his pay packet, but he would typically have a regular duty station, a regular action station, part of the regular crew, and his expertise would then just be called on as and when it was found to be necessary. And that was much more common in the early part of the 20th century, as opposed to full-on dedicated, this guy is here as a diver and pretty much exclusively as a diver. You would only tend to find those either on very specialist ships where diving would be fairly regular, so a submarine maintenance or depot ship, for example, or if you were looking at a very large ship with a lot of crew, and even then that might be quite rare, but if operational circumstances dictated there was a fairly high chance of that diver being needed, then one or more could be deployed. Now, if you've been deployed as a fully qualified diver explicitly for your diving experience, there would still be a duty station and an action station for the diver in question, because apart from anything else, you've got someone aboard. If the ship's going into combat, you don't want them just standing around wondering what's going on and what they should be doing. But their duties would be somewhat less full. So if you're a sailor qualified as a diver, you've got full sailing duties unless and until you are called on to exercise your skills. If you're a diver aboard, you have duties to make yourself useful to the ship, both in and out of combat, but maintaining your equipment, maintaining your qualifications, etc., as a diver specifically, will be assigned as a good portion of that duty. My mum's basement needs more windows asks, one of my uncles was captured by the Japanese in the Philippines and then drowned when the USS Shark torpedoed the hell ship Arasan Maru. Are there any instances of Japanese prisoners taken by the Allies who were killed as a direct result of Japanese military action? I'm sure it occurred at least a few times, but finding exact information on Japanese prisoners of war being accidentally killed by the Japanese military in World War II is somewhat more difficult because, for one thing, the Japanese tended not so much to surrender, and also, obviously, a lot of Allied prisoners of war were taken in the early part of the Pacific campaign, which then meant they were around to be moved around for most of the Pacific campaign. And then when the Allies started sinking lots and lots of Japanese ships, almost statistically, it was going to happen that a ship under the Japanese flag carrying prisoners of war was inevitably going to be hit. Conversely, with relatively few Japanese prisoners taken early in the war and more taken, relatively speaking, later in the war, when the Japanese military is on a bit of the back foot and not having quite as much success as sinking Allied ships, it's much, much less likely for an Allied transport vessel full of Japanese prisoners of war in 44-45 to be sunk by Japanese air or submarine attack. So, and you've also got to take into account the fact that, you know, this kind of incident as a whole, for various reasons, tends to be kept quiet at the time, and sometimes the information only comes out much, much, much later due to people doing a bit of digging. So, broadly speaking, the chances of it happening on a large scale are much less, and I suspect that if such incidents did occur, it's probably going to be fairly hard to find such information. But in much more sort of local terms, you know, a group of Japanese prisoners surrendering, being taken immediately behind the front lines, and then perhaps being caught in a bombing raid or an artillery strike, or, you know, maybe a Japanese pilot or two or a submarine crew being fished out of the water, and then that ship being hit by kamikaze or something. Those kinds of incidents pretty much almost certainly happened, although, again, I'm not aware of any specific ones immediately off the bat. So, yes, it did happen, but it's going to be much, much, much rarer than the obviously highly tragic instance of Japanese ships with thousands of Allied prisoners of war on board being torpedoed by subs that are ostensibly on their own side. Andrew Dederer asks, one side effect of steam propulsion becoming the de facto standard seems to have made navies more professional, but coincidentally it seems to have made them, for lack of a better term, whiter. Whereas back in Nelson's navy, they'd enlist pretty much anyone who could say, God save the king, by the latter part of the 19th century, how much was this change due down to society and how much was it down to technology? Did having fixed enlistments and frequent port visits tighten up on recruiting, or was it fencing off technical jobs and so forth? Now, obviously, racial and social demographics are not my area of expertise by a long shot, and I'm not even going to touch with the 10-foot barge pole the issues that other nations, both generally and specifically in terms of Navy, had with discrimination against non-white people, at least when we're talking about European and the US navies, because for obvious reasons, a navy in service to someone like, say, the Sultan of Zanzibar is not necessarily going to have quite the same discrimination issues against people of colour as, say, the Royal Navy. Now, it is a little bit of a difficult area to research, and as I said, it's not my area of expertise, but from what I've been able to find, and going off also information that I already knew about, I don't think it's strictly speaking the advent of steam propulsion that is the issue. Because when you look in the early steam navy, so the 1850s, 60s, 70s, there's still a small but noticeable number, at least in the Royal Navy, which is what I'm going to focus on because that's pretty much the only one I can bring any degree of expertise to in this case. But there's still a small but noticeable number of black and other non-white sailors. Indeed, one of the very first winners of the Victoria Cross in the Crimean War was a black Royal Navy sailor. And no one seems to have remarked on his race being of any particularly, specific note at the time. It was just, here is another brave Royal Navy crewman. But then you get this kind of, at least from what I've been able to read, this kind of fuzzy period in the very late part of the 19th century, the 1880s, 1890s, and then the issue pops up again in both the First and Second World Wars, and especially by the Second World War, it's noted that by 1939 there is a very specific restriction on non-white, non-European descended people from enlisting in the Royal Navy. And this is somewhat understandably, given the outbreak of a world war, ordered to be lifted, and there are the various competing voices in the upper echelons of the Royal Navy, some of them saying, this is a good idea, we should have done this ages ago, others saying, oh, well, we're only going to pay lip service to that because, we don't think it's a good idea generally. And that rolls on into the immediate post-war Navy. But the general impression that I get is that, somewhat bizarrely, for the majority of the 19th century, the Royal Navy is far, far, far more welcoming to black and other non-white crewmen serving just generally across the board, whether they be, seamen, petty officers, etc., than it is later on, towards the very end of the 19th century and actually into the 20th century. So you could actually make a fairly solid argument that on average, if you look at, how many years situations are in place, on average, let's say a black person trying to enlist in the Royal Navy would actually face significantly more discrimination on average in the 20th century Royal Navy than they would in the 19th century Royal Navy. Which, apart from anything, it shows that these kinds of attitudes are not some kind of endless progression onwards and upwards to sunnier uplands. They are very much cyclical and dependent considerably more, again, not something that's my massive area of expertise, but I would say probably more dependent on societal forces than on anything in particular to do with technology. There's very specific instances in the 1920s, for example, albeit that this is in the merchant marine, of up until that point, black and other non-white sailors being perfectly welcome to sail in merchant ships, but sailors' unions in particular pressing the government to restrict their capability of non-white sailors to serve aboard those vessels. And although obviously you don't have Royal Navy sailors' unions and so forth, I suspect that I would say probably looking at about 50-year period from the late 19th century to World War II and just after in the Royal Navy, where there are actual written restrictions on the employment of black and other non-white, they specifically specify non-European descended men, is probably largely down to a overall shift in societal discrimination and prejudice, and much less down to anything specific technological in the Navy, because the technologies, not just in the Navy, but also more generally, that exist in the period where the discrimination isn't codified and to a certain extent doesn't appear to exist on a very large scale. Those technologies exist before the imposition of restrictions, and they exist after the imposition of restrictions, which would then tend to suggest that it's not the technology that's at fault, or the progression of professionalization of the Navy. Albeit, of course, as I said, this isn't necessarily my area of expertise when it comes to naval history, but that is based on a number of different accounts and books that I have read. If anyone has done a particularly deep dive into recruitment of non-European men into the Royal Navy between 1850 and 1950, or indeed wants to offer their observations of other navies, please feel free to do so in the comments. Rob Crocker asks, I've started experimenting in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts with battleships fitted with 20.9-inch main guns mounted in twin mounts, but with the barrel length shortened as much as possible. This naturally gives the shells an incredibly steep angle of attack, meaning that when the shells do hit enemy capital ships, the shells tend to smash straight through any deck armour. Obviously, guns this size tend to obviate the use of any secondary batteries, but I would typically have this type of battleship escorted by more traditional ships to cover these setbacks. Were there any battleships that followed this particular type of approach in terms of their primary armament? In theory, the idea sounds interesting, but I doubt it would work in practice, but I'd like to hear what you say. So, there are three primary problems with effectively building a Howitzer-style battleship, and those can broadly be defined as effective range, absolute range, and what I would term gun shadow, but we'll come to that in a minute. So, problem one is your absolute range, I would say, and that is simply the fact that for a given amount of charge, and obviously given the fact you've got a shorter barrel gun, therefore that charge is going to be less effective than it would be in a longer barrel weapon. If you are then firing that up in a very high ballistic arc, howitzer style, then the overall absolute range is going to be significantly more limited. And certainly in the era of the 1890s onwards, that's going to be a huge problem, especially once modern fire control comes into effect, because a ship with a longer barrel, more conventional weapon that aims up at 10, 15, 20 degrees, as opposed to a short barrel weapon that's firing up at 50, 60 degrees, that more horizontal facing weapon is just going to be able to fling shells considerably further out, which means you're going to start getting hit considerably further out, and assuming that the two ship speeds are approximately equal, there's nothing that's going to compel that other ship to come close enough for you to even hit it in the first place. So you just die at long range. Then you have the effective range, which would be another problem. Now, I've mentioned in previous videos the fact that even with the more conventional longer barrel weapons, once you get out to ranges of approximately 30,000 yards, give or take a little bit depending on the ship and depending on the guns being fired, you effectively enter a zone wherein any hit on a ship that has any kind of semblance of a competent crew is purely down to luck, because if you have a vessel that can move at 25-30 knots, at 30,000 yards, the flight time of the shell is such that as long as they know when you fired, And assuming that your fire control system solution was somewhat accurate, the enemy vessel can just simply move out of the area of where your shell's going to land by putting the rudder over, because they will change direction and move off of their original projected course sufficiently to carry them clear of your shells. Now, obviously, if the ship stays going in a straight line or whatever, then that changes things, but we're assuming someone halfway competent. And if you are firing relatively low velocity, very high angle, Howitzer-style shells, then obviously their overall flight time at what would otherwise be considerably shorter ranges is going to be quite long, because one, they're not traveling quite as fast, so that extends their flight time, and two, for a given range, let's say 10,000 yards, if you are firing a shell that can reach 10,000 yards with an angle of arbitrarily, say, 15 degrees, draw that arc out, measure the distance of that arc, the length of the arc, it's going to be much, much shorter than a shell that is achieving that same 10,000 yard distance, but having to travel in an arc that starts off with, say, a 50-degree angle and is obviously also going to be going quite a lot higher. And what that means is that the distance for a howitzer-firing battleship, even given that we've established the absolute distance is going to be shorter, but the effective distance is going to be shorter still, because you might end up in circumstances where, yes, maybe your howitzer-style 21-inch gun can reach 20,000 yards, but if it's got a 60 to 80 to 90-second flight time to get there, then anyone with, as I said, even a modicum of sense is just going to get out the way. At which point those two alone just basically rule out using these kinds of things in a modern context, so 1890 onwards. But in perhaps the earlier eras, so we're maybe talking about 1880 and before, whilst you would still have those issues being significant problems, and if you go far enough back, you've also got sails getting in the way of a high arcing shell. The other problem you have is what I term gun shadow. People use various terms for the same concept, but basically it's the idea that a shell that is coming in, obviously if it hits the target, if you've aimed it at the correct spot, so let's say your target is 5,000 yards away. If you have aimed your gun such that that shell would intersect the water at exactly 5,000 yards, you will of course score a hit. But if you're firing a shell that's traveling broadly horizontally, then if we take 5,000 yards as the center point of the enemy ship and it's broadside onto you, and let's say the ship has a 100-foot beam, which is just over 30 yards, then if your shell was going to land at 4,985 yards, you will still just about score a hit. But if it's coming in at a very shallow angle, then if your shell would have actually contacted the water at, say, 5,100 yards, the flight path of that shell is still likely to intersect some portion of the above water section of the enemy vessel on its way past, which is still a hit. And obviously the closer to horizontal you get, the longer the shot you can make before it actually sails over the enemy ship and misses. Conversely, the more vertical the shell is coming in, the much more accurate you have to be, because if you aim at 5,100 yards and your shell comes plunging in like this rather fanciful rendition of HMS Hood's destruction, well, it's just going to sail over the enemy ship and land far away. So even if your fire control system is exactly the same, if you've got a horizontal firing gun as opposed to a howitzer-style firing gun, the horizontal firing weapon will have significantly greater chances to actually hit. The way you can kind of simulate that would be, the reason I call it gun shadow, would be to take a waterline model of a ship and shine a light at, basically at the waterline, just above the waterline level, and tilted down at the angle the shell is coming in. The shadow that ship casts is basically all the region beyond the ship where your shell might have landed if it was intersecting just the sea, but would actually score a hit on the ship. And so the fact that it therefore becomes significantly less accurate is the final nail in the coffin for using howitzers at sea against other ships. Unless, of course, it's the only weapon you happen to have aboard, in which case any weapon is better than none. Mike Lima 777 asks, can it be argued that the Jeune Ecole was an older naval version of what we now know as the Fighter Mafia or defence reformers? The Jeune Ecole seemed to focus a lot more on massed, lower-cost vessels to overwhelm more powerful units. Now, again, the Fighter Mafia is something that postdates the channel's period of coverage and also is obviously an aircraft-based thing, not a ship-based thing. So my understanding of the intricate details of the Fighter Mafia is, again, somewhat limited. However, whilst, from what I can see, both the Jeune Ecole and the Fighter Mafia, as you suggest, focus on lots of lower-cost units to overwhelm more powerful units, I think there are a couple of key differences. Firstly, the Fighter Mafia, at least to my understanding, is present in the United States. The United States is at that point the global hegemon with big military, the biggest military in the world. I suppose you could argue numbers for the Warsaw Pact, but whatever, it's certainly the biggest military in the Western world. The US is not in danger of being unable to produce high-end units in the numbers to counter the opponent. Obviously, at that point, the Warsaw Pact. And also the Fighter Mafia, at least, again, as far as I can tell, are decrying the effectiveness period of what you might term your high-end units, your very complicated units. Whereas the Jeune Ecole never argued that battleships were not effective. They argued simply that France could not match the British Empire in producing these highly effective battle units, and therefore a different solution needed to be found, and their solution obviously was to use torpedo boats because they seem to be the latest and greatest weapon that at low cost could take down these much larger vessels. But even then it's paired with what would be fairly expensive high capacity cruisers to go out and attack enemy merchant shipping. But it's basically an argument from weakness. It's an argument that we cannot go toe-to-toe with our opponent, therefore we must do these other things. Whereas the Fighter Mafia argument seemed to be decrying that the high-end unit was effective, period, and that, you know, the big power would do better to invest in lots and lots of smaller units, which would be the equivalent of somebody in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s Royal Navy saying that actually we should get rid of all the battleships and go with just cruisers and destroyers for fleet defense, offense, etc., etc. And I think it's that also that dual nature of the Jeune Ecole, where the small torpedo-armed craft are there to take out the capital ships, but you have this, you're supposed to have this massive cruiser element to take out the enemy commerce, which in turn is supposed to be the thing that actually puts the enemy to its knees. The torpedo boats are there basically to stop the enemy blockading you. That also rather differentiates it because, again, as far as I'm aware, the Fighter Mafia was advocating for essentially light fighters in mass numbers to go after anything, whether the enemy has light fighters, heavy fighters, or whatever. There's no equivalent to those cruisers to go behind the lines and accomplish the actual victory, unless I've missed something really major in the Fighter Mafia. Were advocating for hordes and hordes of really cheap lightweight fighters and some kind of massive conventional bomber interdiction force, but I don't think they were. King Brock asks, why were boarding actions common in the Age of Sail but seemed to go out of favour during the Age of Steam and Steel? What changes were there that made boarding actions obsolete, and what would have needed to be different for them to be more common in modern times? The short version is an improved ability to defend combined with the fact that the targets of boarding action become relocated within a ship. So firstly, you have the advent of, during the 19th century, considerably more effective counter-boarding weapons. So relatively rapid-fire firearms, and then you let you get things like Gatlings and Nordenfeldts, which are very, very good at sweeping the deck. And of course, the boarding action has to start at the deck, so if you're the defender, you can just retreat into the superstructure and hose down anyone who comes aboard with automatic fire. That's something of a discouragement to boarding actions. Additionally, as ships move into the era of iron and steel, wooden ships, of course, there's a limited amount of defense that a wooden hull can provide. Worst comes to worst, you can break down wooden doors, you can break down wooden hatches, you could even get cannon to blow holes in a ship if you absolutely needed it to. Whereas once you're talking about an iron or steel ship, your weapons, muskets, rifles, etc., they're not going to shoot through, say, a cabin wall the way that a musket could against a wooden wall, because you've got to remember the sides of the ship are very thick, but the thickness of, say, the wall that divides the captain's cabin from the main deck is not very thick. So if everybody's holed up in there, you can level a volley of musket fire through there and probably do a fair bit of damage. Whereas once you're talking about, half-inch thick hull material, your standard Enfield or whatever isn't really going to stand much chance of penetrating that. And likewise, if you've got a locked steel or iron hatch, you're not going to be breaking through that anytime soon with the back end of your firearm. And all of that coincides with the fact, as I said, that the target has disappeared, because there are two ways, really, the two main reasons why boarding actions back in the Age of Sail would be successful is because you would either isolate and either cut down or capture the enemy command unit, because they would be out on the open decks up above and be compelled to fight to defend the ship, but that means they're in relatively easy reach. And or you would take control of the ship's means of propulsion, i.e. the masts and rigging and sails, which are also above the deck. So if you can occupy that upper deck, as well as obviously quarter deck, poop deck, whatever, which is essentially just an infantry action in a confined environment, then you have control of the ship, because you have control of the officers and you have control of how the ship is going anyway. Now, you might not have control of the rudder per se, although you have the ship's wheel, people below decks could cut that. But as long as you have control of the masts, then you can just make sure that the sails aren't in a position to allow the ship to go anywhere. And if the enemy is then trapped below decks with no ability to retreat, you can either demand their surrender, or if they don't surrender, you can throw grenades and so forth in until the last survivors surrender. Once you get into the era of iron and steel ships, you're also into the era of steam propulsion. And now, all of a sudden, the means of propulsion and control are all well below the deck. So in order to take control of those, you'd have to fight your way down through multiple decks, through multiple layers of hatches and bulkheads, all made of iron and steel, with multiple layers of defenses. And eventually, in theory, if you fought your way through the majority of the ship's crew, you might end up in control of the means of propulsion, but that's going to require, obviously, a huge commitment of your own crew, and is very unlikely to happen, because, as we said earlier, you're probably not likely to get past the first locked bulkhead anyway. And the same thing goes for the armament. Back in the Age of Sail, all the armament is below deck. You're not going to be taking control of that except by de facto once you've taken control of the means of propulsion. Once you get to iron and steel, initially still the armament is below deck, but even later on, once you get turret ships and the armament is above deck, the turrets are very heavily armored, and if they're locked up, you're not getting in there either. So without a capability to seriously damage the enemy ship's ability to fight or just leave, boarding actions become a lot more difficult to justify, because you could take control of the upper deck of a pre-dreadnought battleship if you really tried. What's that going to accomplish? If the command crew are either below decks or locked in the conning tower, the main armament's all locked up and all the hatches are locked up, you can run around on the upper deck being sniped off by anti-torpedo boat guns up in the fighting tops, or being pulverized when somebody fires the main battery. There's not a lot else that you're going to accomplish at that stage. John Ashley asks, if the Battle of Lissa was the greatest victory of the Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine, what battle or campaign was their second greatest victory? For the purpose of this question, I'm considering it as the force that was founded in 1786 as the Austrian Navy and disbanded in 1918. Well, it's a bit of a difficult one, because, with the greatest of respect, the Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine didn't really fight all that many major battles. There's a few skirmishes and so forth, and a blockade or two you could throw in there, but none of them really amounted to a huge amount. An action between a couple of frigates, probably not best to add to as your second greatest victory. If it was anything specific, I would probably go out on a little bit of a limb and say the bombardment of Ancona, which I have done a video about, collectively, because they accomplished pretty much all of their objectives with minimal to no losses and deployed a good portion of their fleet to do so. So, big fleet deployment, successful, and put the enemy back quite a while. So I would say that's probably their second greatest overall victory. HMS Inconceivable asks, proportional to total program costs, how have development costs for a naval shipbuilding program changed over the time period that this channel covers? Whilst I couldn't necessarily cite you exact percentage figures, because even within a specific era, those tend to vary massively, broadly speaking, development costs over the time period the channel covers have ballooned tremendously. And that's essentially because, there's two main aspects. One is that in the latter part of the period the channel covers, incorporating new weapons and technology into a ship becomes a lot more common, and that requires a lot more effort before the ship is actually built to make sure it'll fit. And secondly, just the increase in the sheer complexity of the vessels in question. So if you go all the way back to ancient times, there's various issues there, but let's say if we just go to the 1700s, so the 1705, 1720, something like that. If you're designing a brand new naval shipbuilding program, perhaps you're designing a third rate for production in a small class, well, you've got a lot of very similar ships to build on. You might be basically taking the lines of a previous vessel and just making a few minor alterations. Those plans might be done by a single person or maybe a very, very small team of people. You don't really have any weapons development costs because the 18-pounder, the 24-pounder, the 12-pounder, the 32-pounder, 46-pounder, whatever you're going to put in, they all exist in quite large numbers. So it's just a case of, well, we know how much support each type of gun needs, so we don't need to work that out again. And we just put the various gun ports in, and we say, right, well, this ship now carries 70 guns, and we think we should put 24-pounders on this deck and 12-pounders on that deck. And who knows, it's probably going to be changed when the ship's in service anyway. The sail plans, again, you're probably cribbing off of stuff that's been done before with relatively minor changes. It's all very incremental. And the whole ship design, as I said, can be prepared by a single person, maybe a half a dozen max. And the single biggest delay is the fact you have to hand draw everything. Whereas if you go forward to, the 1930s, 1940s, you have to think about, well, now there's radar to bring in, there's multiple different types of gun, not just in terms of this cannon is slightly bigger than the other, but the difference between a triple 16-inch turret versus a twin 5-inch versus a quadruple 40mm, they're all exceptionally different weapons with very different natures in terms of what you need to support them. Is it a between deck mount? Is it an upon deck mount? How deep in the ship do you need to put the magazines? And that's just the weapons and some of the sensors, let alone the engines, the complex hydrodynamic calculations you have to do to get the optimal hull form, and so on and so forth. So, all of that massively increases the overall development cost for a given ship or class of ships. Now, the reason I say it's slightly difficult to give precise figures is, well, one, development costs for ships of the line, etc., can be somewhat obscure. You can look up a figure and say, oh yes, well, so Thomas Slade was paid £56, 6 shillings and 8 pence for the design work for HMS Victory, which is a completely made up number, by the way. But, okay, you might have paid him that, but what did you pay the guys in the moulding loft to scale those up? What other money did he make that he paid assistants who helped him do the draft? Where do you factor in the other projects from which he drew information to make up that draft design, and so on and so forth? And then you also have the fact that, as I said, developmental costs of specific ships can vary quite massively. So do you count the development costs of the 5-inch 38 into the first destroyer to mount the 5-inch 38? Or do you treat that as a separate weapons program? Because that's going to affect the development cost of that particular ship. And using that again as an example, if a particular weapon, sensor, power plant, etc., is developed for a particular ship class, well, that ship class development cost is going to be very high. But if you then just go, well, we're going to use that again in the next class and the next class, and so on and so forth, then the development cost of that particular system is essentially negligible in the later classes, which could make it look like you suddenly cut development costs dramatically, but you haven't, and you've just assigned it to one class, reused that particular technology, but when that technology changes again, development costs will go up again. So it can only ever be a general trend. Eric Van Dooting asks, pardon the source, but the Wikipedia page for the Eastern Solomons Order of Battle notes several US destroyer classes, including the Porter, Gridley, and Benham classes, as having low elevation main batteries. Is this accurate? And if so, what was the maximum elevation of these guns? What was the first class of US destroyers to have a high-angle dual-purpose main battery? Well, it's partially accurate in as much as the Porter class, as seen here, did have low-angle twin mounts, because this was the 8-gun destroyer leaders, along with the Summers class that was built in the interwar period. But as far as the Gridley and Benham classes, no, that's completely inaccurate. I have no idea who put that in, but whoever they did needs to go back and check their history, because as far as single 5-inch 38 mounts are concerned, which of course the Gridleys and Benhams both use exclusively, a mixture of Mark 24 and Mark 30 mounts, the single 5-inch 38 exclusively elevates up to 85 degrees. There are a variety of differences in minimum elevation or depression, but the maximum elevation on a single 5-inch 38 mount is always going to be 85 degrees, unless it's a Mark 30 Mod 80 mount, which is found on some escort carriers, which admittedly is again a surface action only mount, but since both the Gridley and Benham class destroyers are notable in not being escort carriers, they have 85 degree maximum elevation, just the same as every other single 5-inch 38 mount on a US destroyer. Sam Fisher asks, could you give us any information on the advantages and disadvantages of a whaleback styled hull? I've read that 43 were built in the span of a decade, but then were stopped production after that single decade. I was curious why that was. Also, in the museum inside of SS Meteor, there were plans for a militarised whaleback ship that never came to fruition, and I was curious about what the thoughts were behind it and why it was never built. The whaleback design comes from essentially the idea that if you are either towing a ship or just manoeuvring a ship along, at least in waters where you're going to encounter significant wave action, you have two ways of going about dealing with the waves. On the one hand, you can try and push your way through them, keep the waves away from you as much as possible, so at that point you want a high freeboard, near enough vertical sides, and then your deck up top is horizontal. However, that will result in a lot of resistance. So you've got a big flat sail area on either side, which means that the wind, if it's coming crossways, will push you around a fair bit. And then likewise, at seas that are hitting you from anything other than dead in front will essentially be, at least for the however deep your draft is and above the water, be stopped by your ship's hull, which means that all of their force goes into shoving your ship sideways, which you may not want, before the water is then deflected or runs down the hull. Whereas with the whaleback design, so called because when the ship is fully loaded, it kind of looks like a whale to a certain degree, as you can see here. The idea of this is that both high winds and waves, instead of smashing into the hull and meeting direct resistance, will just kind of go over the hull, which minimizes that force, which means in theory the ship can continue in a nice straight line, having to put much less effort into staying in that nice straight line, which is useful for cargo ships generally, but especially useful if you're trying to tow a bunch of barges or other ships, which otherwise might end up going all over the place, because obviously they're just attached to you by a flexible attachment, whether that be chain, wire, or rope. So those are the advantages. The disadvantages, of course, is that because of the radius of the curve, there is something of a limit as to how large you can build your ships, because at some point the whaleback will get so high out of the water that the water will just be splashing up against it anyway without an ability to run over it. Or alternatively, you keep the portion of the hull that's above the water relatively low, at which point you have dangerously little reserve buoyancy left. Another problem, particularly with freighters, is the fact that the cargo hatches therefore cannot be full beam width, or near enough full beam width the way a more conventional hull would be, and that limits the speed that you can load and offload the ship, and also limits the size of things that the ship can carry. So you can either carry small unit cargo, or you can carry bulk items, liquids, grains, that kind of thing. But even with those, your ability to offload them is limited compared to ships with much larger cargo hatches. And the benefits that come from the curved upper hull are really limited to lower speed applications, because once you start trying to proceed at high speed and you've got a relatively low rounded hull, or even just bow like this, although you do see it in some early destroyers, the reason it's abandoned in favour of a very high forecastle relative to the overall size of the ship when it comes to small destroyers is that once you're at these considerably higher speeds, the weight of the water that's almost continuously pressing down and running over your ship massively impedes the efficiency of your engines when it comes to trying to push you forward at high speed. It's better than having stuff flood down through hatches, obviously, but the benefits of the whaleback hull diminish and then turn negative very quickly as your speed goes up. So there's a marginal benefit for slow speed freighter craft, but for a warship, it's not really worth it. If the warship's going to go at any particular great speed, it's also with a continuously curved hull much more difficult to armour such a vessel against incoming fire. And once ships get considerably larger, heavier power plants and are being built considerably larger and heavier in terms of the cargo vessels, then the benefits that the whaleback design grants in this stage, they run into A, the negatives that we've talked about before, but B, also the fact that they're just being outcompeted by much larger, more conventionally laid out vessels, which can offload and unload their cargo massively quicker. So any savings you might make in just being able to progress in a straight line a little bit more efficiently are going to be lost by the fact you're going to be on the dock hours or days longer. Robert Knapp asks, I've always been fascinated by Force H and Admiral Somerville. So what was the overall impact of Force H on the Mediterranean and Atlantic naval wars? Also, what could have been done to increase the impact that it had? What ships could have made the difference in how it was utilised, etc.? Force H was incredibly important to both campaigns in various ways, bearing in mind that Force H was not on the roster of forces that the British had intended to provide going into World War II. Force H was essentially a scratch force that was put together in an attempt to try and replicate the effect of having the Marine Nationale in the Western Mediterranean, which, well, after the rise of Vichy France and the fall of the previous French regime, that wasn't really an option anymore. It varied in strength. Most commonly, it's most famous for consisting, as you can see here, of the battlecruiser Renown and the carrier Ark Royal, but at times it had anything up to 3 capital ships present, and at other times it was just a single carrier. Obviously, a bunch of cruisers and destroyers are involved as well, fairly consistently. Now, in terms of those specific impacts, one of the things, by being based at Gibraltar, that Force H was able to do was, as you kind of mentioned, it was able to fight fires in both theatres. In the Atlantic, for example, it was Ark Royal's aircraft coming up from, obviously coming off of Ark Royal, but which had come out from Gibraltar, that did the what would eventually be the fatal hit to Bismarck by taking out its ability to steer and thus leaving it subject to the mercies of everybody else. Force H was also able to provide a stopping point for escorts and convoys that were heading up and down the Atlantic, of which there were a fair few. That's not just east-west convoys going along the Atlantic. It's also a point from which relief operations to Malta were launched in terms of both carriers like Furious, Eagle, Argus, Ranger, etc., carrying aircraft into the Western Mediterranean under the protection of Force H, which would then obviously launch and fly. The aircraft would launch and fly to Malta to contribute to its defence. And Force H was also an integral element of the escort of various convoys to Malta to provide it with more prosaic things like ammunition, food, and fuel, which resulted in some of the biggest engagements in the Mediterranean itself. In terms of increasing its impact, well, that's rather difficult because, of course, the Royal Navy has to, in the early part of the war, cover the home fleet area in case German ships come out of into the North Sea and try and break out into the Atlantic. They've also got to have ships in the Atlantic in case the German ships sneak past the home fleet, and more generally to deal with things like U-boats, so that's the smaller escorts and so forth. They've got ships overseas guarding various other interests, so there's a small element of shipping in the Royal Navy shipping in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific in the early part of the war. You've got ships covering the commerce raiders that are out, the Hilfskreuzer, the Deutschlands, etc. You've got the Mediterranean fleet, which is the primary fleet that's trying to keep an eye on and later on engage the Italians. And then, of course, once the Pacific campaign kicks off, you've got additional commitments initially to the Pacific and then to the Indian Ocean as the Royal Navy's forced to fall back from there. So in terms of increasing the number of ships in Force H, that would be very difficult to do because where else are you going to pull the ships from? Because anywhere you pull a significant number or type of vessels from to reinforce Force H, you're weakening the forces elsewhere. And certainly once Force H gets into its main stretch, which of course it's disbanded once the Italians are out of the war, when it gets into its main operational stretch, one of the big strengths it has is its ability to operate quickly. As you can see here, with Renown and Ark Royal, it can progress at well over 30 knots, so attaching older ships that are slower to it would impede its ability to operate. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they didn't. Rodney and Valiant, for instance, both operated with Force H at various points, but if you really want to maintain Force H as a fast mobile force capable of deploying to either the Atlantic or the Mediterranean at speed in the early part of the war, about the only thing that you can do that's going to improve the situation, given that the Royal Navy is going to be rather hard-pressed for fast carriers in the early part of the war, is going to be assigning either Repulse and or Hood to join Renown out there. Hood also operated part of Force H for a while, but if you had essentially the pre-war battle cruiser squadron plus Ark Royal, now that on paper would give you a very powerful force that theoretically could make things very difficult for the Reichsmarine during the opening stages of their campaign in the Mediterranean because, well, you've now got a force carrying a lot of heavy guns and has air support, which is capable of running down the Italian fleet, which the Queen Elizabeth and ours of the Mediterranean fleet weren't able to do, even if theoretically they might have had a few more 15-inch guns to throw at the problem. But of course that means that in the early part of the war, pretty much everything apart from King George V in terms of fast capital ships is concentrated in Force H, which means you just got to hope King George V is A, online, and B, in the right position should any of Germany's capital ships emerge. And that's basically why they didn't do it. Jeffrey Conley asks, did any of the major navies try to pull a Ryūjō but using cruisers? For example, in the Washington and London Naval Treaties, a cruiser is defined as a ship of up to 10,000 tons with a main gun caliber no larger than 8 inches. Did anyone try and find a way around this rule? Not in the way that the Japanese tried with Ryūjō, because Ryūjō initially was of course meant to exploit the loophole that defined an aircraft carrier as a vessel over 10,000 tons, amongst other things. And if you therefore built a vessel that was 9,999 tons or less, purpose-built for the carriage of aircraft. It didn't fit into any of the definitions that were defined in the Washington Naval Treaty, and therefore you could technically build an unlimited number of them. However, when it comes to cruisers, there is no such loophole, because the Washington Treaty is fairly clear that a cruiser is a vessel up to 10,000 tons and armed with nothing bigger than an 8-inch gun. And it's also very clear that anything over 10,000 tons and armed with a caliber greater than 8-inch will be defined as a capital ship. And of course, the capital ship has its own tonnage limitations for each of the major powers. So unfortunately, there is no loophole where you can build a cruiser and go, oh no, honestly, it's not a cruiser according to the treaty definitions, because, you know, you could, yes, build a ship with 10-inch guns or 9.2-inch guns or whatever and have it be 13 or 15,000 tons, but that would just be classed as a capital ship, which would then mean you've essentially denied yourself half a battleship, which isn't particularly brilliant. And the ultimate stated goals of displacement for capital ships also divide very neatly into 35,000 tons. So assuming you built up to the maximum, i.e. a 35,000 ton battleship, you wouldn't even have spare displacement left over. Although, interestingly enough, when you look at the displacement that would be retained initially, there is a little bit of wiggle room, particularly with the Japanese retained tonnage, but obviously you're supposed to reduce down to the specific aimed for tonnage, so, or in Japan's case, increase up to that. So, yeah, I mean, in theory, you could, I guess, sacrifice one 35,000 ton battleship for a pair of 17,500 ton ultra heavy cruisers, but then you'd be down a capital ship. So why exactly you'd want to do that is a bit beyond me. The only way you can really cheat your way around the treaty limits on cruisers in terms of their displacement and armament would be either by just flat out lying about your cruiser displacement, which the Italians and the Japanese both did, or, as I've said before, I deeply suspect what the British did, which is to build a 10,000 ton 8-inch cruiser, but one which is predisposed and pre-designed to accept a bunch of upgrades that would increase its displacement quite significantly. As I've said, I'm reasonably convinced the county class were designed in that way to enable them to accept the fit of a continuous 4.5-inch belt. Richard Hazu asks, after World War I, both Italy and France were given a Tegethoff-class battleship from the Austro-Hungarian Navy. At the end of the war, therefore, France would have 8 battleships, including Prince Eugen. The Italians would have 6 battleships, including Tegethoff. Considering that Italy lost Leonardo da Vinci in 1916, Dante Alighieri was significantly outdated, and they're now inferior to the French Navy in terms of their number of battleships, even after the French got rid of Prince Eugen in 1922. Why did Italy agree to scrap Tegethoff instead of just modernising her into the Reichsmarine, considering that Italy would be left with just 4 battleships against France's 7 after the Washington Naval Treaty? Simply put, money. To refit Tegethoff into the Italian Navy, for one thing, she's going to be the slowest dreadnought they've got. For another thing, you know, she's completely different to everything else, so your refit to make her truly interoperable would require near enough, it makes no difference, a complete rebuild, and that's going to cost an awful lot of money. And even then, there's going to be components which are only manufactured in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, which of course is going to be somewhat difficult to get your hands on once those things start breaking down. And most likely you don't do that kind of massive level rebuild, in which case there's even more stuff that's, you know, unique one-off stuff that you're not going to be able to get your hands on once it breaks, which is going to be, again, a big problem. And the much larger monetary issue, Italy's flat broke. I mean, almost everybody is flat broke after World War I, but Italy and France are especially broke, because when you look at the Washington Naval Treaty, in theory, the French are allowed to retain 3 of their Danton-class pre-dreadnoughts, and the Italians are allowed to retain 4 of their pre-dreadnoughts, and they both have specific exemptions allowing them to build new capital ships in 1927, 29, and 31 to replace those. But both parties are so badly off financially that they scrap them. They scrap even ships they're theoretically allowed to keep during the 1920s in a bid to save money, and the scrapping doesn't even stop at the pre-dreadnoughts, because of course Dante Alighieri gets scrapped, and quite a number of the remaining dreadnoughts in both the Marine Nationale and the Reichsmarine are essentially put into reserves or made into training ships for a good portion of the interwar period. And if that's what they're doing with the ships they already have built by them and are allowed to retain, well, the prospect of taking into hand a relatively small, relatively old Austro-Hungarian vessel, which is going to require a huge refit to make it even vaguely compatible, even if they wanted to, they couldn't afford it. Fluffy Goat asks, the Franklin and Bonhomme Richard, CVs 13 and 31, were both named after Ben Franklin and were in commission at the same time. Are there any other examples within the Channel's time period where two active capital ships were named after one person? And if so, what did that person do to earn such recognition? This has cropped up a few times, although it is relatively rare. So, for example, up until 1910, well, in basically the latter half of the 1900s, you had HMS Lord Nelson, as seen here, pre-dreadnought, and HMS Nelson, a ironclad, both technically in service at the same time, although the latter was in kind of reserve dash being used for other uses, but was still technically in commission. Similarly, you had HMS Wellington and HMS Duke of Wellington, both age of sail dash early age of steam vessels, in service in the 1850s, and the service of HMS Duke of Wellington and HMS Iron Duke overlap a little bit towards the end of the 19th century as well. Once you travel further back in time, then this starts to become more and more common. The Spanish Navy, in the Age of Sail, going all the way back to the Armada and beyond, has a tendency of coming up with naming various ships after, usually of all things, Mary, as in Mary the Mother of Jesus, but naming them all slightly different things, basically going after all different titles. So you have Nuestra Señora de la Santísima Trinidad, Our Lady of the Holy Trinity, Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, Our Lady of the, well, there's usually the Immaculate Conception somewhere in there in the early ones, but sometimes it's just called Concepción. And they're all referring to the same person. And then once you get back, actually pretty much to the time of the Spanish Armada, you end up with ships just carrying identical names, both in the English and Spanish fleets, and both for identical reasons, which is that they've been built by different entities. In the English fleet, it's essentially just that, a good chunk of the English fleet is made up of privately owned vessels, and there's no rule that says just because, Joe Bloggs from Ramsgate has built his ship and called it one thing, you can't build your ship in Plymouth and call it the same thing. There's about almost a dozen barks in, and not B-A-R-Q-E-S, barks as in B-A-R-K, like the dog, in the English fleet, and they're all distinguished by, bark of insert town they come from. There's a number of galleons as well. They're literally just called the galleon of insert town here. But on the Spanish side of things, as well as many Nuestra Señoras as you can shake a stick at, there are a few which are, as I said, literally identical. So you have the San Cristobal, or San Cristobal, I think, which is a Portuguese galleon, which is in the, unsurprisingly, named Squadron of Portugal. But it turns out the Squadron of Castile also has a San Cristobal, which is about twice the size of the Portuguese San Cristobal, but neither one of them was going to give up the names, so, you have two San Cristobals. Then there's even other cases where they actually have to start giving appendations to various ships to make sure that people aren't getting too confused. There's several San Juans involved, one of them being tagged San Juan el Menor. There's several San Pedros, so that's John and Peter, for those of you who can't follow along with the Spanish. And one of them is tagged San Pedro el Mayor, i.e. the major, the biggest one. So again, a combination of ships taken up from private service and ships being built by different nations, but all being cobbled together in the same fleet. Aurora asks, during World War I, why did Japan not send any capital ships to the Grand Fleet, especially the Congos? In part because it's the Japanese Navy, not the Royal Navy Reserve, so the Japanese can deploy their ships wherever they like. But a major portion is simply the fact that in terms of modern capital ships at the start of World War I, Japan didn't really have that many. The Fusos, the Iseis, and even the latter half of the Kongo class wouldn't actually be commissioned until well into, if not towards the very end of, World War I. And by the mid to late part of World War I, it wasn't exactly like the Grand Fleet was short on capital ships, particularly battleships. Now, granted, they did have Kongo and Hiei around, plus the two Kawachis, roughly speaking, at the start of the First World War. But, well, the Kawachis are similar to Dreadnought, and again, start of World War I, they're the only battleships that Japan has, the only modern battleships, so they're going to need them back home, just in case. And to be perfectly honest, given the fact that you've got 13.5 and 15-inch ships commissioning, one or two somewhat difficult to operate 12-inch ships, because again, they're going to be somewhat dissimilar to your own vessels, not really going to make all that much difference at the start, and that just gets worse as time goes on. Now, the Congos, granted, would have been pretty useful in terms of giving the battlecruiser squadron some more fast, hard-hitting capital ships to counter the Germans, but specifically because the Japanese only have one or two at the start of the war, they are very definitely keeping them around, especially because at the start of the war you have von Spee's squadrons floating about. Now, the Japanese do send their kind of prototype battle cruisers, the Nishins, not to the Grand Fleet, but they do help out the Allied war effort in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. So they have committed capital ships of a variety, and of course the Royal Navy doesn't really need any pre-dreadnoughts to help. The only real circumstances where Japanese ships would have been of considerable help would have been in the immediate aftermath of Jutland, where obviously a Kongo or three would have been quite useful for, stopgapping the Royal Navy's battlecruiser capability to compensate for the losses they'd suffered and the fact that a bunch of the other battlecruisers were badly shot up. But the flip side to that, of course, was that all the German battlecruisers that had survived were also very badly shot up, and by the time, even if the Japanese had agreed to release, let's say, a couple of Kongos, by the time those ships had made their way across the entire planet to join up with the Grand Fleet, the damaged battlecruisers in the Grand Fleet would have been repaired, and you had Renown and Repulse coming into service in mid to late 1916 as well, so, the overall need wasn't really seen compared to the complete loss of battle cruisers in the Pacific region, which would have been represented had the Japanese committed significant amounts of Kongos to the Grand Fleet. Whereas obviously by the Japanese keeping their modern forces in and around Japan and the Western Pacific, it meant that in terms of overall Allied war effort, the British didn't need to commit any particularly significant resources to that area, and they could concentrate all of their own ships, which of course operate together much better, at home. VideoDude26 asks, I found myself poking around Google Maps looking for something completely unrelated to naval history when I stumbled upon something that caught my attention. About 2 miles to the northeast of the old Kinburn Fort, there's what appears to be an old 19th century naval fort on a man-made island, apparently guarding the mouth of the Dnieper River. I think that's how it's pronounced. Probably wrong. I can't find anything online about this. What is it? Does it have anything to do with the Battle of Kinburn? And if not, does it have any interesting history associated with it? It doesn't have anything directly to do with the Battle of Kinburn, as you can see here from this map, which is a map of the Battle of Kinburn. If the island existed at the time, it would be roughly in the centre on the far right but it's not there. And as you can see from the deployment of the various ships on that side of the Kinburn Spit, they're not acting like there is anything slightly off the map either. So this artificial island, also known as Mayskiy Island or Fort Isle Mayskiy, again, my Russian is not particularly brilliant, but there you go. It was constructed in the 1890s by the Russians, basically as a backup to dash replacement for the Kinburn forts, because, well, the Battle of Kinburn had shown that it was entirely possible to reduce and take those, whereas by making your own artificial island that backstops it, it means that if you obviously try and attack the Kinburn forts from outside the river, then this new island can fire over the relatively low Kinburn Spit in support, and if you try and enter the river, as the flanking British and French forces are doing in the Crimean War, then you'd be caught between two sets of fortifications that can mutually support each other. Theoretically, that was also supposed to happen with the fortifications you can see up there on the north bank of the river, but it turns out the range of the guns, in terms of accurate gunfire, just wasn't far enough. There's not a huge amount of interesting history to it as far as I can tell, albeit I suspect a good chunk of its history is probably going to be in Russian. But it was attacked during the time period the channel covers by the Luftwaffe, because there were still fortifications there at the time. What's happened to it once the Soviet Union came about and thereafter, I don't know, other than the fact it is there still, so nobody sunk it at least. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, I understand why the 5-inch 38 is repeatedly lauded for its many virtues, but 1. Did the US know or suspect that the proximity fuse was on the horizon when it developed the weapon? 2. Would the 5-inch 38 have been all that impressive without the proximity fuse? And 3. Absent a proximity fuse, wouldn't a British approach to dual-purpose heavy anti-aircraft guns have made more sense? So, in order, did the US know or suspect the proximity fuse was on the horizon? No, because the 5-inch 38 was developed well before the first working prototypes of radar were developed, and, well, the idea that you could both foresee the development of radar, but at the time of 5-inch 38 was actually fully developed, but people are still thinking in terms of death rays, and then foresee its miniaturization down to the proximity fuse, yeah, that's not happening. It was developed purely as, a general anti-aircraft gun with anti-surface use as well, just a dual-purpose weapon. Part 2, would the 5-inch 38 have been particularly good without the proximity fuse? Well, obviously without the proximity fuse, it's not going to be as lethal, but you can get a relatively good approximation, albeit less effective, once you have radar fire control in place, because if you remember looking through various videos I've done that have covered the 5-inch 38, the 5-inch 38 is only the twin turrets, as you can see here, and a number of the single mounts, they have automatic fuse setters built in, which take their information from the fire control system, which is obviously a timed mechanical fuse to make the thing blow up. Now, early war, when the ranging information is based largely on manual optical observations, it's okay for barrage fire, but not for necessarily targeting individual aircraft. But even if the proximity fuse itself hadn't been developed, once radar-directed 5-inch gunfire had become a thing, well, obviously at that point, the precise range to the target is much more accurate and being updated constantly, which would mean that a relatively decent set of fire control predictors would be able to set a mechanical fuse to detonate somewhere roughly in the vicinity of the target aircraft, and of course deliver the shell to roughly the vicinity of the target aircraft. So whilst it wouldn't have had maybe quite the same kill record it does in the late war, it would still have had a pretty decent one. And that kind of relates to the third part, which is without the proximity fuse, with the British approach have made more sense. The British approach essentially being, if you look at the 4.5 and the 5.25, to prioritise slightly more the anti-surface role, i.e. you have a longer barrel weapon, as opposed to the 5-inch 38, which ever so slightly prioritises the anti-aircraft role, so shorter barrel for faster manoeuvring of the gun, etc., as explained in the 5-inch 38 development video. What that approach gives you very broadly speaking, is a somewhat longer effective range, and obviously at the same range is a slightly faster time of flight, with the trade-off of a slightly slower rate of fire. So without the proximity fuse, but with highly accurate radar-directed fire control, I think it would have been a little bit of a toss-up whether the British or American way would have been considered better, because without the proximity fuse, but with good radar-directed mechanically time-fused shells, you would basically be putting a barrage of shells into a box where you think the aircraft is going to be and watching the fireworks, hopefully. Now, a British-style gun would mean that you could start engaging sooner, but the number of rounds you're putting out per minute would be slightly less, whereas the American approach would mean you would be engaging at a slightly closer range, but during that engagement period, you're throwing out somewhat more shells per second. At which point, personally, I would think that the British approach might be better for dealing with massed formations that are coming in, because you want to disrupt those formations as soon as possible, so being able to reach out further is better at that stage, and it might make the fire control calculations just that little bit easier, even at closer ranges, because obviously, if the shell's traveling slightly faster, it's going to get to the target quicker, so your shell can be timed a little bit more easily. Conversely, that will be more sensitive to slight errors in the time fuse settings. And if you're dealing with single attacks or massed swarming attacks where people aren't really following any particular formation, then in those circumstances, the American approach has the advantage, because at that point, if you've got, 3 dozen aircraft all swarming you in multiple different directions, then the statistical chances of any, even with radar-directed fire, the chance of any one particular heavy anti-aircraft shell scoring a direct hit are relatively low. So just being able to chuck the largest number of shells out there as quickly as humanly possible would be the way to go in that case. Richard Goss asks, what's the story regarding HMS Cavendish's carrier conversion? So it's actually an example of remarkably quick turnarounds of thinking by the Royal Navy during World War I. The Royal Navy, sometimes fairly, but more often unfairly, gets stuck with a reputation of being a little bit stuck in its ways and not willing to adapt or change. But Cavendish, aka HMS Vindictive, is a good example which counters that. So the Hawkins class were originally built as 7.5-inch gun cruisers, fairly big, fairly long range, designed to deal with German commerce raiding cruisers, essentially in some ways kind of restarting the same design principles that had led to armoured cruisers and then battle cruisers in the cyclical way of many naval designs, both past, present, and probably future. But by the time Cavendish was actually laid down and construction got well underway, the fear for German commerce raiders at sea had pretty much diminished. All the big nasty ones that a ship of the Hawkins class would have been sent out to deal with had already been destroyed. There would be the odd disguised merchantmen, etc., but there were plenty of other small cruisers perfectly capable of dealing with them. And so the need for a big, expensive anti-commerce hunter was not really, they didn't quite need it as much as they needed other things like anti-sub escorts and so on and so forth. But then, having seen the early efficacy of some of their early seaplane carriers, the Royal Navy decided, right, we need some aircraft carriers. And at the time, the best practice seemed to indicate you should have a flying off platform forward and a landing platform aft. Although we know, obviously, with things like HMS Furious, that wasn't necessarily the best idea long term, but it's what they had at the time. And the Royal Navy decided, right, we should have some aircraft carriers. They ordered some, and then they realized, well, because we're trying to build merchant ships, escorts, by the latter part of the war, large light cruisers and so on and so forth, we don't have the capacity to also build a couple of relatively large proto-aircraft carriers. So that all gets thrown by the wayside. But then someone goes, well, we've got this Hawkins-class hull that's tootling around in the shipyards, and we don't really need it as another Hawkins-class, but it's fast, it's large, it's long. We might make a half-decent aircraft carrier. I mean, it's got a good freeboard because it's designed to run at high speeds in the high seas, chasing down commerce raiders. And everyone, well, yeah, that's actually a pretty good idea. So it effectively had a relatively minimal amount of work done to it. You can see here that it's got one of the forward 7.5-inch guns, for example. There's no point in taking that out if it's not getting in the way. And it was turned into a sort of aircraft carrier. Coming into service just as the war ended, so didn't see any real action in World War I, but would go on to see quite extensive action as a carrier during the intervention by the Royal Navy in the Baltic against the Bolshevik Revolution. But with that over, once she was brought back, they looked at her and decided, well, obviously this is not the ideal flight deck configuration. They'd done experiments with various other ships in the interim, and they knew that having a single continuous flight deck was the way to go. But then, was it worth converting her again into a fully flight decked carrier, the way that they were obviously then going to do with Furious, and they were in the process of doing with what would become HMS Eagle, etc., etc. But it was concluded that given the requirements of aircraft carriers as they were beginning to emerge, Vindictive was not suitable. She would be too small. She was well below 10,000 tons, and Hermes was pretty small, and she was above that. So they decided instead to eventually return her to being a cruiser, albeit that she didn't go back to the name Cavendish. She retained her name Vindictive, and that was the end of her service as a carrier. She did go on to be a cruiser and then a repair ship, etc., etc., but essentially she is an intermediate stage between the seaplane carriers and so forth, like Engadine and the first Ark Royal carrier, etc., etc., and then from her come ships like Eagle, Argus, Hermes, and the eventual state of Furious. October Nid asks, what are your thoughts on LEGO Age of Sail ships like the classic Pirates line? Obviously the scaling is all wrong, partly due to just being waterline models, but are there any that look more real than others, or are they all just fun toys? I mean, as a kid I loved LEGO, and the sailing ship lines they did, Imperial and Pirate, were always very fun. I mean, as you say, obviously the scaling is hilariously wrong, but there are a few that are a little bit closer than others. This is the Black Eye Schooner, I believe it's called. This is probably about the closest one to a realistic vessel. As you can see, it's got 4 guns on each side, so it's an 8-gun ship, so it's very definitely a non-rated, so this designation as a schooner is fairly accurate. It's probably got one too many masts, but given that the mizzen mast is a very, very tiny lateen-sailed thing, you can probably forgive it that, and the high stern indicating that it's probably also modelled after a somewhat earlier vessel, maybe a 16th or 17th century vessel. It's close enough for government work. A lot of the other ships obviously would only have one or 2 guns. They're effectively gunboats. So you double up and say they've got 2 to 4 guns. But yeah, at that point you're talking about cutters and gunboats and so forth. There are a few slightly larger models, especially more recently. They've done some pretty big ones. But those tend to suffer from the fact that actually, even something like the Imperial flagship, a relatively recent release, still only has 4 guns per side, but otherwise looks to be a considerably larger vessel, which is a little bit deceptive, even if the overall hull style and shape looks relatively decent. Then, of course, from playing with them, you've got the fact that some of the LEGO ships, especially a lot of the early ones, are built purely out of blocks, which can make them staying afloat in a bath or something a little bit of a difficult prospect. Some of the later ones were actually built with big hull sections that were designed specifically to allow them to stay afloat, which is better, but also confines you to specific design parameters. So yeah, this would probably be my pick as the closest to, and some of the other LEGO ships that, again, hark back to the slightly earlier era come out looking a little bit better for it. But you've also got to remember that you can design your own, and this is actually where the preformed hull sections come in, because you can just get more of them and extend the ships, which is quite good. Or you can download something like Bricklink Studio and virtually design your ships. And there are a few people out there. I mean, there's some people out there who've just literally built pretty good-looking LEGO ships of the line and frigates purely out of blocks, which I suppose is the original purist way of doing things. But if you want to save yourself some time and hassle and use some of the preformed ship hull components that came with some of the mid to late era LEGO Imperial and Pirate vessels, you're then using those, obviously just extending them to give you a somewhat longer vessel, you can actually put together a pretty creditable frigate if you're willing to spend the money to then have it in real life, or just enjoy the pretty digital model and know what you could have. Primark359 asks, the story of the Pacific Clipper returning by going the wrong way is great, but was it necessary? Could they reasonably have made it back the right way? Would New Caledonia, Fiji and Canton Island be safe enough that they could have returned the way they came? Would the danger of having been shot down by Allied forces in the confused immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor be greater than the danger from Japanese aircraft while traversing the Dutch East Indies? And do you think they made the correct decision based on what they knew? I think they made the right choice given the circumstances, because remember, at the time, wars broken out because of the attack on Pearl Harbor and then subsequently Japanese attacks on the Philippines. Yes, crossing over the Dutch East Indies potentially invited being shot down by either side, but at the time that they set out on their voyage, they didn't necessarily know, or could reasonably be expected to know, that the Japanese would end up attacking the Dutch East Indies quite so quickly. At the time they're opening their instructions, that's not quite happened. Whereas attacks on Hawaii and Wake Island already have, and you don't necessarily know at that stage what's going to happen next. Are the Japanese going to launch follow-up attacks on Hawaii? Are they going to try and invade Hawaii? Are the Japanese going to somehow establish fighter patrols out of Wake Island? All of these things could indicate a significant risk of running into Japanese fighters on the way back if they went back the way they came. And with the best will in the world, a Boeing 314 has exactly zero defensive armament, so running into any kind of fighter, even an A5M, would not be a very good thing. And assuming that you manage to dodge and weave your way all through that and you arrive at Pearl Harbor, well, as we found out in the opening stages of the Pacific Fleet submarine campaign, the defences of Pearl Harbor were a little bit trigger-happy and twitchy for quite a while after the December 7th attacks, which is entirely reasonable. And therefore I would suggest that a massive, great, relatively unfamiliar grey-silver flying boat appearing out of nowhere might attract some unwanted attention. So in the grand scheme of things, the idea of, really don't want to get shot down by the Japanese and really, really don't want to get shot down by our own side by accident, coupled with, not wanting to fly a giant, somewhat confidential flying boat into an active war zone and instead going round the long way, that's probably a reasonable choice. I mean, obviously it's a commercial aircraft, it's not that confidential, but, why give your enemy information that they might otherwise not have if your flying boat gets captured in whole or in part? It might help the Japanese. Now, obviously, that's the reasoning of the time talking. We know the Japanese already had the H-8K. They didn't really need any help in the building of gigantic flying boats, but the pilots and Pan Am didn't know that at the time. Brandon Minders asks, the British had a number of great ships in the 15th century, Mary Rose, Henry Grâce-Dieu, etc. For one reason or another, many of them disappeared before the Spanish Armada showed up. Did the British have any great ships when the Spanish Armada showed up, and if so, what were they doing? And if not, why not? So one thing you've got to bear in mind is that when you're looking at Henry VIII's great ships, by the time of the Spanish Armada, you're talking a very long time since they were laid down. If Henry Grâce-à-Dieu and Mary Rose had still been around in the time of the Spanish Armada, they both would have been well over 70 years old. Even the Jesus of Lübeck, which was a decade or two younger than Henry Grâce-à-Dieu and Mary Rose, was still considered old and incredibly worn out, which is why Elizabeth allowed Hawkins and Drake to use her. And again, that was some time before the Armada sailed, by a couple of decades. So basically, if it was a great ship built for Henry VIII in his classical naval build-up period, it was far too old, and they're long gone. However, the British did have a number of great ships when the Armada showed up. The Elizabeth Jonas, the Warspite, the White Bear, the Triumph, technically speaking, the Ark Royal. Now, not all of those were on a par with the biggest ships in the Armada, but they were on a par with most of them. The Triumph was the single biggest ship in the fleet, and she was a great ship that was basically on a par displacement and size-wise with anything in the Spanish fleet. The only difference being that the Spanish had more than one ship in that size class, whereas Triumph was pretty much on her own. But then, with that said, you've got to remember that the race-built galleons, of which there were quite a number in the English fleet, were, well, the earliest of them were 350, 400 tons burthen, but the later ones, which were the more prevalent, were kind of 500 to 600 tons burthen, which meant that the race-built galleons and the smaller great ships at around that 500 to 600 ton burthen mark are actually, capable of, if you want to just go by size at least, going toe-to-toe with a good portion of the Armada's combat strength. Now, as I said, the Armada does have a fair number of 700, 800, 900, and even 1,000-plus ton burthen vessels, which are obviously bigger, but they don't make up the majority of the Armada. They make up a couple of very hard-hitting squadrons, but if you take the average Armada combatant and line it up against the smaller English great ships and the race-built galleons, size-wise, they're pretty much on a par, and the race-built galleons would actually obviously be longer because they're longer and sleeker and somewhat lower, so more of their displacement is in their hull. So that's kind of the upper end of, obviously then you have the fact that there's just flat out more large Armada combat ships versus the English ones, the English fleet relying considerably more on smaller vessels. But the big great ships, the ones I mentioned at the beginning, they are for the most part used as squadron flagships, and they don't get stuck into the very, very detailed fighting until Gravelines, or however you pronounce it, towards the end of the campaign, because the earlier parts of the Armada campaign involve sailing up, delivering multiple broadsides, and then sailing away again and not getting in close. And for that, the smaller ships, the smaller great ships and the race-built galleons are considerably better placed, because if a big ship like Triumph goes up, it's not as agile, it's not as quick, and if the wind falls off, it could leave it perilously close to being double-teamed or triple-teamed by a bunch of equal-sized Spanish vessels. So, for the most part, they're command and coordination ships. That is, of course, until you do get up close and personal, at which point they're quite advantageous to have. Toreno asks, while looking at naval battles, I've noticed there are often quite a few photographs and film reels of various events. For example, Bismarck firing her guns in the Battle of Denmark Strait, HMS Queen Mary and HMS Invincible exploding, HMS Indefatigable sinking at Jutland, etc., etc. My question is, who would have been taking these photos and film recordings during these battles? Was there dedicated film crews on board to take propaganda photos? Was it naval crew taking recordings for post-battle analysis, or just ordinary crew taking opportunities to record these events? Short answer is yes. The slightly more complicated answer is it's a combination of all of them. So, although dedicated film crews separate to the Navy, like BBC or local equivalents, are somewhat rarer, they do show up at times, obviously especially in World War II. Then you have specific camera crews in service to the Navy. They are quite common. They can be either commercial photographers under contract to the Navy, or they might be enlisted or Navy men or officers who have equipment and or skills, who have made themselves known by those skills, at which point obviously then the Navy in question might say, right, okay, well, we're going to give you either the job to do this or give you the equipment and the job to do this, to take recordings for post-battle analysis and to give an idea of what's actually going on, because even back then they appreciated that, you know, things might happen that could be caught on picture or on film that might help learn what's actually going on when you get back for post-battle analysis. Because of course once a ship arrives back in port, the ship's crew probably will have done at least some patching up. Whereas if you are taking film or taking pictures of things as they happen, you might get images of what damage either to your ship or to the enemy ships looked like at the time, which you can then look at what the crew have done and go, oh, okay, so that's what the crew did, this is what the hit did, and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, it still makes for, if you get the right recordings, it still makes for good propaganda. And obviously both the dedicated separate film crews and the film crews or cameraman who are enlisted or under contract to the Navy would all have their stuff have to go through the censors anyway. And then you have the enthusiastic amateur sailors who might have usually still cameras, very, very rarely cine cameras, and that could obviously be the enlisted crew, it could be officers as well, and they might also take the opportunity to take some photos or video as and when the opportunity presents itself, because your action station would obviously be fairly important, but if your action station involves a good view of what's going on and what you specifically are there to do is not needed at the moment, then, well, why not take a few photos and so forth. And then, of course, theoretically, those would also have to get past the censors. And so you see this whole variety of people aboard different ships at different times taking pictures and video for different reasons, and that's where we get all of the stuff that we have today. Most irritatingly, there was, at one point, apparently, about 3 hours of film footage taken at the Battle of Jutland. But then when the film got ashore for development, they discovered that there had been some kind of problem and the whole thing was blank. I don't know exactly what it was. Maybe there was kind of light leak in the canister. But yeah, that's probably the single biggest loss of footage historically that we otherwise could have answered an awful lot of questions. But there you go. There's not a lot you can really do about that now. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, there's a modern clipper ship cruise liner called the Royal Clipper. What strikes me as odd is that each of the 5 main masts use a large number of wide but very short sails, perhaps only a quarter to a third as long as they are wide. In drawings of Age of Sail ships, they seem to have almost square sails, or close to square. Were there Age of Sail ships rigged with this many sails, and what advantage do so many sails offer over fewer large sails? Or is this just a modern design choice and aesthetics? These kinds of sails are a feature you begin to see in the 19th century. If you look at clipper ships, it's probably the best example. Look at the very earliest clippers. They're rigged much more like you'd expect a ship of the line to be rigged. By the time we get to something like the Cutty Sark and then on to the later clippers and then the late 19th century sail-driven merchant vessels, they look a lot closer to this. Now, there are 2 primary reasons for this. One is that with multiple smaller sails, it's much easier to make fine adjustments for that ultimate little bit of speed, because of course you have more sail area to play around. Well, not more sail area overall necessarily, but you have more individual sails to play around with. So the fine-tuning of the ship's sailing qualities is a little bit easier. Theoretically, it is a slightly less efficient way of doing things, because obviously you've got multiple yard arms there, which on a ship of the line you have fewer of them, and the yard arm is dead weight. But the efficiency that you make up, compensates for that. The other thing is, especially why this comes about in the latter part of the 19th century, and I suspect also why it's in use on a ship like this, is the effort involved. Because if you're on a warship that has 400, 600, 800 crew, you can have quite a lot of people up working the sails. And that means big, very heavy sails are possible to use because you can put enough muscle power into getting them set up and trimmed, etc., etc. Whereas if you're on a merchant vessel that maybe only has a crew of less than 24, you physically will not have the manpower to manage those sails, whilst also keeping at least some people on deck to manage the rest of the ship, at which point these kinds of more rectangular, significantly shorter sails are lighter and therefore easier to manage with relatively few crew. And hence you start to see them develop on the merchant vessels. And the reason why I say I suspect that's also the case here is that I highly doubt on this ship they've got a couple of hundred trained crewmen running up and down, setting all the sails and trimming them and pulling them back in again all the time. I deeply, deeply suspect that these sails are either wholly or in part managed by mechanical means, or at least there's some mechanical assistance going. And again, by having lots and lots of small sails, that means you only have to have a certain amount of power available to the systems, which can then furl, unfurl, etc. the sails. Whereas if this ship was set up with, say, 2 or 3 really big sails per mast, you would need a much more substantial bit of, winding motors, hydraulic systems, electrical systems, etc. So it's partly aesthetic, but I would suspect also considerably more about the budget, both in terms of manpower and in terms of the fittings of the ship. Paul from Chicago asks, in World War I, the British lost a couple of convoys to German cruisers in the North Sea. During the scattering of PQ-17, this is obviously what Dudley Pound was trying to avoid. Was he involved in the World War I convoy losses? No, he was not directly involved in that. He was in command of HMS Colossus in the Grand Fleet, and then in the early part, I think it was spring, summer 1917, he was promoted back to the Admiralty. So when the convoy losses losses to convoys on the Norway run happened in late 1917, he was part of the Admiralty down in London, wasn't directly involved in any of it. But obviously he would have been very aware of it, since a lot of the information and some of the problems which resulted in the loss of those convoys, or additional losses to those convoys, were rooted in the way intelligence and so forth was handled within the Admiralty. But you've also got to remember that by the time of PQ-17, Pound has had far more immediate experience with what happens if convoys end up with surface ships running amok in them, or are subjected to concerted air attack, because he's seen what happens when, say, Admiral Scheer gets out amongst some of the convoys in the early part of the war. He's seen what's happened to the Malta convoys under various attacks from below the surface, on the surface, and above the surface in the Mediterranean. And PQ-17 is potentially facing an even worse set of circumstances, because you've got the Luftwaffe, you've got the Kriegsmarine U-boats, and you now have a battleship and its escorts, which, apart from when Scharnhorst and Gneisenau got out, the Allied convoy efforts had not yet at that point faced. John Plate asks, I know it took the British Navy a little more time to figure out the whole dual-purpose gun thing, and I know they ended up settling for the 4.5, but why did they? You mentioned in previous recordings they'd pretty much fixed the issues with the 5.25, and with the coming of jets, wouldn't it be better to go for the bigger gun? What am I missing? Well, there's a few issues. Firstly, the British having seen how dual-purpose guns were working everywhere else, and also, obviously, they had dual-purpose guns pre-war, at least on their bigger ships, and having seen how the Americans utilised the 5-inch 38, had fully come on board with the idea of a universal dual-purpose gun for use across the fleet. So it would be the main armament of destroyers, and then the secondary battery for cruisers, and potentially even the secondary battery for capital ships. So although the 5.25 stuck around for a while as a battleship secondary battery, there was no real question of ever putting a 5.25-inch set on as the secondary battery for a cruiser. In fact, there were even some design studies well into the war that were looking at the 5.25 as the main battery for cruisers, obviously in addition to the Drydock class. And you just are not going to fit a 5.25 on a destroyer, not in a twin mount anyway. And so when you compare, for example, the 5.25s as found in Vanguard, which are pretty much the fixed versions, with the 4.5-inch mounts as you would find on a Daring-class destroyer or a Minotaur-class cruiser had they been built, or the last versions of Lion had they been built, the 5.25-inch weighs, in terms of your total mounting, weighs about twice as much as the 4.5 twin. So you're talking about between 45 and 50 tons for the twin 4.5, and just pushing 100 for just under 100 for the twin 5.25 as found on Vanguard, which means that obviously deck space allowing, but in terms of weight, you can get two twin 4.5s for the weight of a single twin 5.25, and the 4.5 has both a theoretical and a practical rate of fire that is considerably greater than the 5.25. So in terms of, let's say you have 100 tons of displacement to allocate, if you stick a pair of twin 4.5s in, you will get something in the region of about 3, maybe pushing close to 4 times as many shells in the air for the same displacement on the ship. Which, yes, the 4.5 inch is going to reach slightly less than the 5.25, but that's a lot more shells in the sky. And with the coming of jets, obviously the other thing is the 4.5 mount can maneuver faster than the 5.25 mount, which, you know, tracking jets is quite useful to have your guns being able to move quickly. And with that many more shells in the sky, if they're all then proximity fused, the chances of actually hitting a fast-moving jet are considerably higher than your theoretically, individually, potentially slightly more capable 5.25-inch barrel, but is just chucking many, many fewer shells up into the air. And part of that's also down to the fact that at the time both of these systems are being developed, the much faster loading machinery that is eventually used in all sorts of different guns, as with the introduction of quick-firing guns at the turn of the century, it was much easier to implement that technology early on smaller guns. So it was much easier to, although they're not full auto-loading, most of the time it's much easier to get a 4.5-inch mount in the early to mid-1940s to fire at a considerably higher rate than it is to get a 5.25 to do the same thing, because when you look at the rapid firing auto-loading 6 inches, etc., they, even in the US, post-date the introduction of this sort of rather boxy twin 4.5 by quite a margin, and the British one takes a little bit longer still to come into service. JT Daily Update asks, I was looking at the standard nomenclature for naval vessels, General Order number 541, 17th of July 1920, which classified ships such as battleships, monitors, aircraft carriers, cruisers, submarines and destroyers into 2 separate subclasses of first-line and second-line ships with separate abbreviations for each type, i.e. a battleship, first-line battleship is designated as BB, whereas a second-line battleship is designated as OBB. I presume this is to distinguish older ships from their newer counterparts, but do you know of any ships that were actually given this second-line designation, and what roles these older ships would have in US naval strategy and how that would differ from their newer counterparts? Given the timing, I suspect this was going to be an attempt by the US to basically create first and second line fleets out of their existing fleets, because they knew at that stage they've got the Colorados coming into service, and the Omahas under construction. They think they're going to get the South Dakotas and the Lexingtons and successors to those ships, and presumably more cruisers and so forth. And they're going to be also looking at, we've got all these Wicks and Clemson class destroyers, which are significantly superior to our older ships. But a lot of these older ships have only actually been around for a relatively short period of time. You've got to remember at this stage, even the USS South Carolina, the US fleet's first dreadnought, had only been in commission for 10 years at that stage. So I think they were probably looking at it from a perspective of, we've got this upcoming fleet that's going to be based around the 16-inch gun, and maybe the 12-gun 14-inch ships will also be frontline, but we'll have 10-gun ships, so at least New York and Texas, possibly also Nevada and Oklahoma, and a whole slew of 12-inch dreadnoughts, which we don't really want to get rid of just yet, because apart from anything else, our potential rivals, mostly the British at this stage, but potentially the Japanese, also have some 12-inch ships floating around. So it might be worth keeping them, at least available, but we also acknowledge that, let's face it, any ship that's on with 12-inch guns, if you take it up against a ship that's got 8, 10, or 12, 16-inch guns and armour to match, that's not really going to be long for this world. And apply the same logic to your cruisers and your destroyers and your subs, and suddenly you can see the creation of a 2-tier fleet, at least until more ships can be brought online that are more commensurate with the designs of the late 1910s and early 1920s. But as far as I know, none of these designations were actually assigned, and I think that's because you then have the Washington Naval Treaty, so pretty much everything that most likely would have gotten an O, insert other designation here, almost certainly then went off to the scrapyard. And if they were planning on any of the few retained vessels having that designation, well, at that point it wouldn't have made much sense. If you've got 15 or so battleships around, you're going to designate 1 or 2 of them as basically second-line reserves? Not really. So you just keep them all with BB, CA, CL, CV, etc., etc., etc. So effectively, assuming it wasn't dropped for some other administrative reason, I think the Washington Treaty basically just caused everything that you would have otherwise designated with an O designator to be scrapped, and then you didn't need the designator anymore. Atomic Braytonic asks, as a pilot myself and with an uncle who was a pilot on the USS John C. Stennis, I'm curious about the life of a naval aviator aboard a US carrier, and maybe other nations. With the crew interactions, did sailors like aviators, or were there rivalries? Well, there are some obvious lines of division, such as the fact that pilots tend to all be officers. The majority of the crew is not, so there's a division there. But from what I've read, both for the US Navy in the Pacific and the Royal Navy in various theatres, etc., at least for the very end of World War I and certainly going into World War II, it seems to depend very, very much on the group of pilots and the crew in question. There are some ships where the pilots and the crew get along absolutely famously. They're, basically just all one big happy family, as much as you can be, on a ship that's at risk of being blown up any particular moment of the day. And at the other extreme, there are some ships where specific squadrons basically live in isolation from the rest of the crew because neither side wants anything to do with each other, and when they do come into contact, there's usually some form of blows being exchanged. In most of those cases, the problems tend to be more on the pilot side of things than the crew side of things, albeit obviously the number of people who are going to be giving testimony at various disciplinaries are going to be the majority crew, so perhaps their overall view has bled into this, but who knows. And then, of course, you've run into the fact that these relationships can change over time. So, you could have a squadron where its pilots have a degree of friction with the crew, but then they go out into battle and that a particular squadron happens to sink a fairly big enemy ship or help at doing so, thus bringing glory to the carrier, and then the crew may be very happy with them. Or conversely, you might have a squadron and the crew aboard a carrier and they kind of get along okay, but then the squadron, let's say it's a fighter squadron, really badly stuffs up on the cap one day, at which point bombs fall, a couple of dozen people are killed on the carrier, and it seems like the pilots weren't doing their job, and suddenly the relationship between that fighter squadron and the crew deteriorates very quickly. So, yeah, it is a little bit all over the place, but as a general rule, there's always going to be a certain degree of underlying rivalry and tension between the air group and the rest of the crew, but whether that expresses itself negatively, neutrally, or just in the form of happy hijinks and positivity seems to be very much on a case-by-case basis. Lincoln Locker asks, what mechanisms were in place for enforcement of the Washington Naval Treaty? Were there any clauses that detailed punishments for violating the treaty? For example, what would have happened if Britain or America had decided that they wanted to continue building battleships for export? Strictly speaking, there weren't any, because it was acknowledged that it would be almost impossible to do without the kind... I mean, the thing is, these days, if there's some kind of big international treaty that somebody violates, in theory, you can put in a series of economic measures, sanctions and so forth against them. But one, that assumes that the party that's doing the enforcement is the biggest one, the one who controls all the strings on the economy. And obviously, if the big party in question is the one who's actually violating the treaty, then there's not a lot everybody else can do to stop them. And back then, you didn't even have a particularly globalized economy, so even that wouldn't really work outside of straight-up naval blockade, which is, of course, an act of war. In theory, if one party or another violates the treaty does contain clauses that say that everybody should meet together for further consultation to decide what to do. But to be perfectly honest, that would either result in just a lot of diplomatic pressure on the people who are violating the treaty to try and get them to scrap whatever ship it is they've done that violates the treaty, or else everybody else agrees that, okay, this is now the new standard and everybody else gets to have a proportional number of that kind of ship, whatever it happens to be. Or very occasionally, if it's exploiting a loophole rather than violating the treaty outright, it just closes the loophole and everybody moves on, which is kind of what happened with Ryūjō. And so, yeah, if Britain or America had decided they wanted to continue building battleships for export, there's not a huge amount that anyone directly could have done to stop them. The single biggest threat was the fact that the treaty was put in place by mutual agreement in order to prevent a very expensive and potentially ruinous arms race that no one power was particularly sure they either wanted or could win. And one party violating that treaty rather flagrantly would therefore reopen the possibility of such an arms race. So whoever was planning on violating the treaty had to consider, if I'm going to do this publicly, am I willing to accept the consequences of basically everybody else deciding they're going to outbuild me? And, that's enough of a deterrent in and of itself for the most part, unless, of course, you just flat out lie and say that you are complying with the treaty and just don't let anyone take too close a look at your ships. Peter Guy asks, in 1909, the SS Waratah, a passenger steamship, disappeared without a trace somewhere off southern Africa, and her loss remains a mystery. In the age of steel and steam-powered warships, do you know of any similar instances of a naval ship of any significant tonnage, i.e. battleships, cruisers, that kind of thing, not corvettes, disappearing without a trace with no other ship to witness how she foundered? In terms of warships, the only ships that are currently listed as having disappeared without a trace from that era are essentially submarines of various descriptions. And in terms of military vessels, not strictly speaking warships, but ships in service to somebody's navy, there are only two unsolved disappearances. The one being the rather famous USS Cyclops, obviously disappeared in the supposed Bermuda Triangle, and the other one is this vessel that you can see on the screen now. This is the Copenhagen, which is a very large, or was a very large, Danish Navy training vessel, which disappeared in the 1920s, again without a trace. There's been some speculation that she hit icebergs and sank, but nobody knows. So those are the only two large naval vessels in the sort of latter 19th, early 20th centuries that have vanished. And we still don't know why, where, or how. Everything else, as I said, has just been submarines that have vanished, which they tend to do with relatively alarming frequency, even in peacetime. Dave asks, did the Reichsmarine consider an all-forward layout for the Deutschlands main battery? Technically speaking, yes, but not probably in the way that you're thinking. So there wasn't a design with this kind of hull, as you can see with the Deutschland, with a pair of 1111s forward or something similar to that. In the initial design scope of what they were going to build that would eventually become the Deutschland, when they were considering the options between what was essentially a heavy cruiser hull with oversized guns or a variety of different coastal defense ship designs, several of the coastal defense ship designs armed with either 12-inch or 15-inch guns did have an all-forward layout. In one case, simply by dint of the fact it had a single triple 15-inch turret, and that was it. So the fact that that turret was mounted forward technically made it an all-forward design, but there were a few designs using triple or twin 12-inch where they did have all the gun turrets forward. But the whole coast defense battleship idea was dropped long before they commenced detailed design on what would eventually become the Deutschland class. So yeah, once they decided that they were going to use triple 11-inch and they were going to make a high-speed pseudo-heavy cruiser, they didn't look at all forward designs for that, as far as I'm aware. Mark Griffiths asks, when reading up on Operation Neptune, the landings in Normandy, I found a note saying that HMS Warspite only had turrets A and B in operation. Aside from being a potential weakness to justify her plot armour, do you have any more details as to why she was down 50% of her main armament? Well, quite simply, she didn't have only 50% of her main battery running, as you can see here from this and several other photos of Warspite operating off of the beaches of D-Day. She in fact had 3 out of 4 turrets running. A and B were both running, and Y, as you can see right there aft, was also running. The only turret that wasn't working was X turret, that being the super firing aft turret, and that is purely because she had taken obviously Fritz X bomb damage operating off of Italy, and whilst the damage was patched up, it was never fully repaired, and part of that lack of repair was the fact that X turret remained non-operational, and indeed would remain non-operational for the rest of Warspite's service career. But Y turret, as you can see, was quite happily and enthusiastically joining in the fun. Connor Johnson asks, was there anything stopping someone from building a 3-decker broadside ironclad akin to a first-rate ship of the line? The most I know is there's a couple of French 2-deckers. Did technology just move on too quickly for it to be viable? The big problems with a 3-decker ironclad are weight, stability, and guns. Now you can see here this is Magenta along with Napoleon. So Magenta is one of the 2-decker French ironclads. But fundamentally, the guns that are being introduced on ironclads right from the start are considerably larger weapons. So you think on HMS Victory, for example, the lowest gun deck, the heaviest gun deck, is 32-pounders, whereas once you get onto the single gun deck of Warrior, you're talking about 68 and 110-pounders, which, you know, the shot is considerably larger and the guns are much, much larger. So that means that you are going to need a somewhat bigger deck in terms of height in order just to fit the guns in and all the necessary equipment. And that in turn means that if you make a multi-gun deck ship, that's going to get disturbingly tall, disturbingly quickly. Couple the fact with the fact that if you make a multi-deck ironclad, that means you now have multiple decks that you need to cover in armour, which is going to massively increase the weight, and with the height of 3-deckers also massively deal blows to your stability. So essentially, if you build a 3-decker ironclad at any reasonable size, you're going to have it chronically underarmed to the point that it might have lots of guns, but it won't be able to defeat other similar vessels. It'll just be able to really mess up wooden warships. And a 3-decker ironclad with that much iron on its side is going to be hilariously unstable unless you make it absolutely colossal, you know, Great Eastern style size. And in any case, it's going to weigh an absolute ton, which is going to make it very difficult to maneuver, make it somewhat slow, and thus faster ironclads with the single decks, with those single decks having fewer but larger and heavier guns, probably just going to run circles around you. So yeah, that's basically the reason. In theory, as I said, you could build something like Great Eastern and make that a 3-decker broadside ironclad with really heavy guns and tons of armour. But when you look at the cost of Great Eastern, you would get one ship, not a fleet. Andronor asks, if a warship is scuttled instead of sunk, is it a war grave if there were sailors aboard it when it happened? I presume you mean sailors who had died in the combat that caused it to be scuttled. And if so, yeah, pretty much. Regardless, I think, of the exact mechanism by which it sank, if a ship has been in combat, and as a result of that combat damage, it is being sunk, whether that's being sunk directly by the effects of the combat or whether it's being scuttled by its own side because it's irrevocable. If there are still sailors' bodies aboard, which, that very unlikely, but it may not happen. If the damage somehow magically didn't cause many casualties, and those casualties that it did cause were taken off before the ship was scuttled, then it's not a war grave. But in all likelihood, if a ship is in a situation where it's been in combat and its own side is scuttling it, there are probably going to be bodies aboard. That makes it just as much a war grave as anything else, in my opinion at least. The word asks, repeated 13 times, asks, considering that the term light cruiser came from light armoured cruiser due to having belt armour, and the heavy cruisers came out of the treaties are derived from this light cruiser concept, could one call heavy cruisers heavy light armoured cruisers, or super cruisers super heavy light armoured cruisers, and still be technically correct? I think there's a bit too much of a break to be really accurately technically correct, because of course, yes, you're correct, the town class of World War I and a few others are referred to initially as light armoured cruisers because they are cruisers that have belt armour, which traditionally was the realm of the armoured cruiser, but they are quite small compared to the traditional armoured cruiser. I think maximum 6-inch guns instead of 9.2s, so they get called light armoured cruisers, but that very quickly gets changed to light cruiser, hence light cruiser squadrons at Jutland. But by the end of the First World War, even that has just been derived down to cruiser, and then with the Washington Treaty, they're all cruisers. So whether you've got 6-inch, 7.5-inch, 8-inch guns, whatever, they're now all cruisers and remain that way for a decade. And then you get the London Naval Treaty, where you then get the split between heavy and light cruisers, which is now nothing to do with armour and purely to do with the fact that one has 8-inch guns and the other has up to 6-inch guns. Plus, of course, the tautology involved in using something like heavy light cruiser, which is just a little silly. If the gods wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, how good are the English language sources for the various Scandinavian naval wars? And who is your favourite admiral from Scandinavia, and why? In my experience, as a whole, we're not really that blessed with English language sources for the majority of Scandinavian naval wars. If you want to look at the Baltic, Robert Frost, back at the beginning of this century, did a pretty comprehensive overview of a lot of the time period from kind of the 15th, 16th century onwards. There are a couple of volumes of that, and weirdly enough, there's a few turn of the previous century, i.e. 1900s to 1910s era books about naval battles in the Baltic in English. But outside of that, apart from some overview histories and perhaps specific histories of specific navies, specific countries, books in English looking at the Northern Wars, even the Russo-Swedish War, etc., are fairly thin on the ground. And even Robert Frost books, they're looking at at conflicts in general, not specifically just the naval stuff. And the further back you go, the less information there is. A lot of information that we have in the English language about these conflicts tends to be mostly people who speak the various Scandinavian languages who've been good enough to translate articles about said conflicts, at least as far as I've seen. once again, as with quite a number of these kinds of issues, if anybody has any good English language recommendations beyond those I've already said, please do chime in the comments below, because I'm always on the lookout for new and interesting books about conflicts that are a little bit harder to read about in English. And finally, Todd Webb asks, if one of the countries that produced a vertical triple-engine powered ship post-Dreadnought had experimented with installing instead a vertical quadruple expansion engine, and it had turned out favourably, which one would potentially have had the best improvement for its country over the historical vertical triple expansion powered ship? One of the hexagonal German ships, the New York class, Blücher, etc., etc. I think in the short term, I would go for the Nassau class, because the main advantage of the quadruple expansion versus the triple expansion engine is about a 10% jump in efficiency, which means that if your power plant is 10% more efficient, you don't have to burn as much fuel. And given that one of the major issues the Germans had was burning horrifically bad coal, which clogged everything up, well, you now can go for a bit longer because you're not having to burn quite as much of it, so you're not generating quite as much clinker and ash. And thus, that would be a benefit to them. The same might apply to Blücher, but Blücher's main problem at Dogger Bank was just lack of speed generally, not the efficiency of the engines. Albeit you might be able to argue that maybe a quadruple expansion engine might have eked out an extra knot or two on Blücher. Probably not, and it probably still wouldn't have helped her anyway, so there you go. But if you want to look at the long term, then the New York class would obviously benefit the most because they're around for the longest, and if they've got more efficient engines, then when their coal firing is replaced by oil firing, then there's even more benefit to be had from it. So they might either have space and weight set aside for other things on top of the modernizations they did receive, or maybe they'd go a little bit faster one way or the other. And that's it for this second half of the Patreon Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. As you may have guessed, I am successfully back from Australia with plenty of content coming up over the next several months, probably starting late August, early September, all to do with the many ships and places that we visited over there. But yeah, more on that later, spoiler alert. And in the interim, plenty more to be getting on with now. So thanks for listening, and see you again in another video.